Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about good books for a change. Yes, we're going back with To Wheel of Time tomorrow, and I have no problem with that, I'm sure. But today we're talking about something that I wanted to finish for a while, and we're getting one step closer, and that is the Book of the New Sun. And today I'm going to talk a bit about the Citadel of the Autarch, which is part 4 of it. Will I talk about Earth of the New Sun in the future? Well, yeah, of course I will, but it'll probably take a bit longer until I get there. But for now, we're talking about Citadel of the Autarch, which is fantastic, of course. All right, once again, if you're new here, welcome. I talk about books and stuff. If you've been with me for a while, thank you for doing so. I value that. It must be hard. And before we get started, I want to cheer one of my Patreon backers. This one's for you, Livia. Thanks for doing this. Cheers. And if you want to get cheered personally, or want to tell me what kind of beer I should drink, there's a Patreon. If you don't want to do that, that's totally fine. You'll get all the videos. There's no special treatment there for you where content is concerned. But yeah, I'd very much appreciate it anyway. However, it is time to talk about Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun some more, and especially the Citadel of the Autarch, which is... I'm not going to do a spoiler-free review part. It's if you've stuck with it so far, go and read this one as well. Otherwise, if you didn't like the first 3, I doubt it'll change now. So yeah, let's get into the meat of the thing immediately. Well, so here's the point. It wraps up the original story of the Book of the New Sun. Earth of the New Sun is, well, its own thing. Something that happened that was released much later, and thus I will consider this basically as the ending of the story, which is important because we're going to talk about circularity and shit like that in a minute here. So, what's there to talk about with this one? Last time I spoke a lot about time and how time and distance are portrayed in these books. This one talks about war and violence in a lot of ways. And it also talks very much about what it is to be a person, what makes us human, and things like that. Those are the big themes. There's more in here, and I'll point bits out here and there, but that's the large themes here. Plus, of course, circularity. All right, let's start with something. I think the opening lines of this volume are excellent. And also very Malazan style, because it's I can't quote it by heart because I'm not clever enough for that kind of stuff. It's I thought I knew about war, and I thought it would just be a new experience because I knew about violence. But war is another land. It's another place. It's very different. And yeah. That's something that we see in this book a lot, because this book is way more violent than the previous 3 are. We have a large battle scene, we have a lot of stuff around that, we have Severian acting extremely violent towards other people, especially Daria, that one mercenary that he, maybe assaults sexually. I'm not quite sure with that one. It's heavily implied, however. Stuff like that. We see him being way more aggressive in a lot of ways, which, kind of makes this really feel like a different place compared to the other 3 books. Which I guess is exactly what Gene Wolfe wanted us to take out of it, more or less. But we're going to look at the violence bit later on a bit more, but, what I wanted to look at, however, is another thing that is early on, because we have more stories that are being told, and I like that a lot. Of course, it's something that has been in the Book of the New Sun a lot, right? We have all these different stories within the story. Last time we had the story of the boy called Frog, and there was the story of Theseus, basically, in Claw of the Conciliator, and there's always stories within stories in these in these books. And this time round, we have a very interesting aspect there, and that is Severian, after one of the stories, the story of the Askian, the good man, the just man, says that he believes that the two things that are only human, what make us human almost, are stories and music. I guess you can extend it to being, art in general, right? But, and I feel especially the bit with stories, like everything else is given us by, he calls it being created, but, it's everyone else has those kind of things. They're given to us because we're beings and so forth. Well, stories are what makes us human, and thus are the most dear to us. And that is very much like where I see Gene Wolfe's personal motivation for telling us these stories come through. Like, this is by telling stories, we become human. By telling stories, we act human, and that's an important way for us to understand the world. Now, there's anthropological research out there that claims the same kind of thing, and like that whole idea is like when we try to define what makes us human, the fact that we invent. We invent these kind of things, stories, and tell them to each other is certainly that we are, think in narratives is certainly something that comes up a lot. And it is important to see that here, and once again it explains why so often in these books we get told stories that try to explain something that we can take out for the larger narrative of the story. Gene Wolfe speaks to us through stories, and the idea that we should take something out of those stories is very much, is implied heavily in these aspects of Book of the New Sun. Plus, of course, I just love those stories that they tell. And once again, we see how Wolfe cleverly goes and takes bits and pieces of mythology and stories, that folk tales and whatnot, fairy tales, and twists them into something new. For example, the story of the two brothers, the seal hunters story, is very close to what you might call that English folk tale or folk song that's, been around, like the Cruel Sister one with the two sisters, that for the love of a woman, one kills the other one, and then she's thrown up on the beach again. And yeah, that, the story basically is exactly that, like how they, through death, after their death, still managed to accuse their murderer of the deed. And he takes that specific storyline and turns it into something else here with those two brothers. And, that's just really cool. I just, really love those bits, because it's like when you can sit back and see Gene Wolfe do what he's best at, which is, take something familiar and then make it undisputably Gene Wolfe. In a way, you know what I mean? It just takes something and makes it fantastically his own, and you're like, wow. It's like he can just sit there. It's like, I can play around with stories, and I've done so as a dungeon master, as a game master for all kinds of role-playing games, but I could never do anything like that. I'm just not I don't have the mental space to go there. That's crazy good. And once again, I love the stories that are told there, and the way they then sit around and talk about the stories and try to read those implications out of the stories, of that storytelling competition, when, through telling us the larger story of Severian, Gene Wolfe basically tells us what to do with the Book of the New Sun, which is read it, and try to figure out what he wants to tell us. And this is something that we need to talk about now. That's the idea of meaning. Because I will not go and answer all kind of speculation. I know there's entire books written on what did Gene Wolfe try to tell us, what's in there, which bits and pieces mash, which bits and pieces are hinted at, what's going on there, right? We know that stuff exists, and I don't want to really add to it. I want to just show up other possibilities. I'm sure you found your own answers, which is the next part. There's a large part of this will be personal. It's your personal way of reading the book. So I will not try to understand or not try to explain how Gene Wolfe talks about time travel, or whether it is time travel, or whatever it may be that he's trying to tell there. However, I want to look at why it is important the way he does it, because what he does in this book specifically, I mean, he's done it before in the other books as well, but with, Severian getting his answers from Malrubius, the dog, and Master Ash, the time travel guy. What he does there is he hints at scientific or science fiction-y concepts like time travel, the nature of time itself, all of these things. But he tries to explain it through someone who doesn't understand it, which makes a lot of sense because, yeah, actually it's hard to understand. So what you should look at is more the idea of like how we communicate these things, how we try to communicate ideas, because there will always be a gap of understanding. Always, because we have an idea and we turn it into language, and then someone else who has their own unique experience will try to make the best out of what they hear and see and read. And Wolfe builds that in to the narrative already by having, Severian use weird language to explain something that we would normally, if we're classic science fiction, get described in a way different way, I guess. Which, yeah, really cool, I feel. So we're not going there. What else is there to talk about here, which I personally... I mean, there's really cool scenes here. Like, the whole episode with Master Ash, the time travel guy, is an important one. And there's, I guess, a parallelism here that we need to look at, and that is the parallelism between Master Ash and the Green Man. Because remember, both of those characters come from the future. They come from different possible futures. We have those discussions. And both of them are sort of freed by Severian. Freed of their prison, because if you want to look at the house of Master Ash, the time travel scientist, he can't leave it, or he thinks he can't leave it. But Severian drags him out forcefully. And when you look at the Green Man, all the way back in Shadow of the Torturer. No, not Shadow of the Torturer. That guy's in Claw of the Conciliator, right? Severian gives him the means to freedom, to actually, come out of his prison. And in this book, both of them show up, and both of them stand for the two possible outcomes of what happens with Severian, which is, either he becomes the new sun and manages to revitalize the sun to keep, give future life to this planet. And that's the future of the Green Man. Or he fails, and everyone after him also fails, and Earth gets frozen completely, which is the future of the last house. Which, is a really cool name, because it's not on, it's the last house that will be standing all the way until the end of the world. Which is really, I just love the idea that, from each level of that tower goes further into the future. That's just, really insanely cool sci-fi technology there that never gets explained, but, it's still really cool. But yeah, and we can look at the fact that by forcefully dragging out Master Ash, in a way, he collapses that future, because Master Ash vanishes. And that would basically say that this is not the future that, Severian is headed to, because, otherwise Master Ash would have probably stayed visible. Really, and that's a really cool idea. And then you need to look at why does the Green Man survive, and why does the Master Ash not survive? Also, is there something in the way he does things there that is key to that future thing? And the question there, I guess is that Severian helping the Green Man is acting, in according with the wishes of the Green Man, who doesn't have a name, which is, that guy wants to be free, so Severian gives him the means to freedom, whereas Master Ash does not want to be free of his prison, and Severian forces him out. Now, you can make the argument that, yes, once he's out there, he's like, yeah, I always wanted to do that, I just never dared, and you kind of forced me to. But still, And that's just like a wonderful thing. And then the Green Man comes back to help Severian and said, like, I'll be back in further futures as well. And yeah, that's a really interesting, a really important aspect, I feel, that we, to look at how Gene Wolfe does these kind of things, because suddenly we get hints for the future, and it's like a very sci-fi parallel universe kind of concept, but he manages to do it fairly subtly in a way, and I just really love that. Another thing is, now, what's a human? How do you become a human being? What does make you a human being? And that's a question that is like asked a lot in this book. I mean, it's always asked, but it's very much asked here. And there are, I guess, different different answers to it, but one that like Gene Wolfe is very much into is like looking at your past and building, becoming fully yourself, which the Autarch, the self-ruler, is obviously the perfect example of. And you have that nice, not parallelism, but the opposite with the Autarch and the Commonwealth of the Autarch versus the Askians, right? The Askians are the end point of, so to speak, collectivism. I mean, they're beyond that. I mean, yes, you can probably look at like how their slogans sound very, communist, more like Chinese communist from like the 50s than anything we have today, but that kind of stuff, or North Korean communism. But the point is that in their society, they aim to make all humans equal, like not equal, but the same, and thus erase individuality. Whereas, on the other hand, you have the Autarch, who has in their person, and Gene Wolfe implies that there have been female Autarchs. I mean, obviously, the previous one is androgynous, but yeah, gender doesn't play into the autarchy. The point is, they take the many possibilities, the many facets into one person, which is the opposite of like perfect collectivism, if you want to call it that, in the Askians. What we have with the Autarch is sort of perfect individualism, because he as an individual is the sum of all his experience, all their experiences. They are the sum of all their experiences, of all their pasts, and all the things that have led to this one very specific moment in time. Which, once again, is really interesting, and obviously not a reaction, but definitely a nod towards what you see in say Dune, right? Like when we have the scenes in Dune and Dune Messiah later on, when they drink the water of life and look back on their past generations and can talk to their past selves, which in that case leads to like a family bloodline or whatever you want to call it that has this end point. Whereas in Wolfe's version, and you can argue about whether that like is the strict reading that I just applied to Dune is the correct one, because obviously if you have like all of humankind for like millions of years, you will have a large pool of experiences of all walks of life, not only elitists or whatever. But with the way it is handled in this book, in a Book of the New Sun, since the raising of a new Autarch usually happens randomly by whoever happens to be near to the guy, to the previous Autarch when they die. There is even more randomness in there. There is no like manifest destiny or anything like that because you're part of a specific bloodline. No, it's sheer randomness depending on where you are, which once again I guess is important to look at, because it says, and like while the Autarch, the self-ruler, is the personification of the Commonwealth by being the perfect individual in charge of every decision and so forth. Because of the randomness, every citizen of the Commonwealth has the possibility to be that Autarch. They just need to be in the right moment in time to, be there and eat the brain of the previous one, right? But that possibility is there, and it's important to have that, because that means that we all should strive towards being that person, being in charge of ourselves, knowing who we want to be and knowing how we want to be in a lot of ways, and being aware of all our past experiences, being aware of all the lives we've touched, which that's like the even more important aspect that we'll later when Malrubius talks with Severian, right? Yes, Severian has ingested the previous lives and memories through the Alzaba, or in this case not the Alzaba, this other other drug thing that he uses to eat the brain of the Autarch, but also Tricycle and Malrubius, who he just has in his brain because of memories. And we all have the capability of doing that. We all can recall the people we've met along the way, the people whose lives we touched, whose lives touched our life. And that's sum of experience, that's sum of empathy that we get through that sort of contact. That's what makes us who we are at the end of the day. And that's a pretty heartwarming thing at the end of the day, to realize that that's sort of like the good way to be about it, right? I personally do approve of that. It's pretty cool. Now let's look at some more bits and pieces here, right? Circularity. Time seems to be circular in this idea that Wolfe is explaining here, which, I'm not saying it's a wheel of time. I'm just saying it works much better here than it does in certain other books that talk about time's circularity. But of course, the circularity thing is in the narrative as well, right? The narrative of the Book of the New Sun is circular. It starts with the Citadel, with Severian. It ends at the same place. It only takes 1 year. He talks about like how it's 1 year, and 1 year is once again a circle, because after the year we start all over again with the next year. But it's circular. All of it is circular. Time itself is circular for like Wolfe or for Severian. His trip is circular, and his and the year that it takes is once again another of those circles. Circles play a large role here, right? You have the other thing in one of the stories, the story of the Armiger's daughter, which is a fantastic story, by the way. It's full of rings. It's the golden ring that they need to find and go pirating, apparently, which is cool. And just a quick aside, we know that there's like a Borges reference all the way back into all the way back in Shadow of the Torturer when we talk about old Ulthan the librarian. But especially that specific story of that Foila, is that her name? Whatever, is telling, has with its, talk about the Pampas and the way he uses his prose in that specific story, reminded me a lot of the prose that you can see, like the way Borges talks about his native country in some of his less obscure occult stories. And I assume that is on purpose, because every one of those stories that we get there in that, shifts in tone to, not imitate, but pay homage to a specific style of literature, or like a specific culture almost, if you want. Right, you have the fable of the of the birds there. You have the seal hunting Nordic folk tale. You have the moral fable of the good man, or the just man. There, just a quick aside. It's really cool. So we have the circularity of time as a huge thing here, and I guess the important bit here is, and we're going to go back to what Severian does, and that is circularity in the way we see it in the Book of the New Sun, means we can always try again and do better next time round, which is, there is improvement through that circularity. Severian, believes himself to be a better person after this trip than he was before. Also better than, say, that hypothetical other Severian that he believes was before him, who may or may not be, the, what is his name, Apo Punchao, the guy from the second book that they raise. Even, all of that, there is improvement through repetition. And I want to look at that in a moment, because the whole story of Severian going on this quest and coming back can obviously be read as the hero's journey in a very classic Joseph Campbell kind of way. Because one of the things we don't talk about much when we talk about the hero's journey with Campbell. Campbell obviously does a lot of things that I personally don't really agree with. And that is all the Jungian psychology adds to it. But the idea is that when, Campbell goes like, that's all our stories are basically this one story, the hero quest. Going somewhere, doing something, the hero's journey, and coming back. But that is just a symbol or a metaphor or an allegory for personal growth. We go into a dark place, we come back, and we come back as stronger people, which is a narrative that is obviously used a lot in media when it's like, I fucked up, I come back, now I'm stronger and better, dark times make us better. That's not necessarily true, but it's a very powerful narrative. And at the end of the day, when you look at the Book of the New Sun, the only thing that really changed between the beginning of this story and the ending of the story, and Severian is very clear in showing that when he comes back to the Citadel and explains that all of his old friends have not really changed at all. The only one who has changed is Severian, and while technically he is now the Autarch, and that's an exterior change, what it mostly is an interior change, because he has gained all these, experiences plus all these previous lives. He now knows who he is. So what he brought back, so to speak, from that dark trip into the belly of the whale, to use one of those wonderful things that Joseph Campbell just throws in because he tries to make sure that everyone understands his story type is always everywhere. What he brings back is self-knowledge. That's the hero's journey right there, in a way that, say, George Lucas, even though he tries real hard, never really got to. The personal, the psychological level that is so important for Joseph Campbell. That is something that Gene Wolfe, takes here and makes very, very explicit through the story that Severian is telling. And that's just interesting. Because that gaining of knowledge, of new knowledge, so to speak, is really old knowledge, right? He finds out who he really is, and you don't need to have all these adventures. You just need to realize it at some point. I just want to look at a couple of interesting bits. One of them is recontextualizing a lot of things, right? Because if you read this for the first time, you now know that Severian is literally many people. There's the good biblical reference of calling him Legion, which, nice one there, nice one. But the important aspect there is that it raises the question, who is telling us this story? Of course, it is Severian, who is doing the telling, but Severian is also Thecla, who we get a much clearer picture in this book, in this volume, than in the previous ones. It's also now all these older Autarchs. So which bits and pieces that we get in the story before are told by Severian the boy? Which ones are told by old Severian the Autarch? Which bits are told by any number of the older Autarchs that put bits and pieces in there? Which stuff is Thecla? And I feel the way Gene Wolfe does that is just fascinating, because he tells you a story that you read and you realize the guy is an unreliable narrator. And then at the end, you find out, no, there's not only one unreliable narrator, there's possibly hundreds of them. And yeah, playing with reader expectations is obviously something that Gene Wolfe is fantastic at. And the reason why I think it is so fantastic is that he leaves all these hints in there and makes the whole thing feel so convincingly consistent. Plus, of course, any inconsistencies can be ascribed to, different different voices within Severian, which is, a neat trick. But the consistency makes it so good, right? There's a bit right at the beginning of this volume when Severian remembers a scene from the first book, from the first volume, where they look at a client in the torturer's tower, a woman whose leg has been flayed. And in this book, we just in a neat aside, he's like, yeah, that was Thekla's maid who got tortured, possibly to find information about Thekla being a traitor and all of these things, right? It's these small bits and pieces that make up a lot of the consistency of the story that make it feel real, and give us that feeling that this is like a full-blown work. I assume that Gene Wolfe wrote the entire thing as in one go before actually releasing the first novel. I know he wanted it released as one book and didn't, but because of publisher stuff. But it feels like the whole thing was constructed as a whole before the first one was even published to keep those consistencies in there, and it's pretty fantastic from where I'm sitting. So yeah, we have these like small bits of like how to make things consistent there. And yes, the final thing, I guess, is once again the exuberance of Gene Wolfe's imagination, going places that like not no one, but very few other authors dare to go, because even like a lot of science fiction that we read is fairly limited in its scope, like in its imagination. And Gene Wolfe is like, you know what? I want to have people riding on pterodactyls, on dinosaurs. I'll just put them in. I can explain this. It's far in the future. They might be genetically designed or whatever. I'll just use them. Or something else, some other else, flying bird that is, or flying animal that we then translate into like a dinosaur, which, why not? He does that a lot, and he has all these small bits and pieces when he plays with translation, when it's like, at the end of the day, it's about meaning, right? It's about meaning that we ascribe to words, and the way we use those words. And he gives us like all the time these small hints where we realize that no, he may say Destria, but he doesn't mean a horse, because apparently those have claws and sharp fangs. They might still eat grass, but is grass really grass? We don't know at this point. And the fact that he gives us the key, so to speak, to the universe, when he's like, at the end of the day, you imagine this the way you want, because I'm telling you, what I wrote here is not what it really was like. This is just an approximation where we reach that like gap of communication between the people and the author and the reader that he makes explicit there, and that's just like a really fun thing. Like, just two final things. One of them, Gene Wolfe is aware of, I'm talking about Gene Wolfe, the writer now, it's like, the ending of the story is like, if you've missed something or whatever, go read it again, just as I will write it again. Very few books tell you to just go and reread them because you probably missed most of it. The confidence in there is just, fantastic. About the fact that I've read it for like 5 times now, and I still discover new bits and pieces of like, yeah. You can do that, Gene Wolfe. You can tell me to go and reread because I probably missed it, because so far, yeah, I probably missed it. The other thing that I just realized today is a small bit at the end when we find out that the coin that Vodalus gives Severian all the way at the beginning is a false coin. It's not a correct. It's false coinage. It's a fraud. It's a fake, and that means that the whole like oath of fealty, the relationship that Severian has with Vodalus, is void because he wasn't actually given an actual coin, and that puts like a lot of the actions that he then that Severian does towards Vodalus in like a very different perspective, and it's these small details that I completely missed the first 4 times reading it that make me know, well, I guess I should go and reread it real soon and see what else I can pick up. So yeah, we still don't know whether Severian will actually go and bring back the new sun. But we know that he's come back to where he started out, which is at the Citadel, and he is maybe a better man, maybe not, but he sure is a lot of people at this point. And I enjoyed it once again. Alright, I hope you enjoyed Book of the New Sun so far. Let me know what you think in the comments, and like, share, subscribe, do all those wonderful things. But mostly, let's talk about Book of the New Sun, right? Cheers.